Okay, Erev Tov, everyone. Wonderful to be here, and thank you to the organizers, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. When I was thinking about what we should talk about tonight, so I was thinking, something that is going to relate to the place where we are and the nature of the trip. I thought would be nice. I thought that it's always good to talk about the parasha. Rabbi Wein would always teach us what he learned from his Rabbi, which is that everything is in the parasha, right? Whatever's going on that week, we know is related to the parasha. So we'll talk about the parasha as well. And then I realized that tonight is also the yahrzeit, the fifth yahrzeit of Rabbi Sacks. So if we can come up with something that will relate both to all three, to the parasha, to the trip, and the theme of this trip in the north of Israel and Rabbi Sacks, then we'll do quite well. So let's see if we can bring it all together. And I want to share with you, if we have time, two, maybe three ideas that are rooted in our parasha, but that will hopefully tie in with all those different things that we've said. The first one, as you can imagine, is actually based on something that Rabbi Sacks said. There's no greater tribute that there can be to him on his yahrzeit than sharing his words of Torah, right? Letting him speak rather than talking about him. So let's dive into it. The parasha that we have this week is Parashat Chayei Sarah, and it's very interesting. We have two parashiyot in Sefer Bereshit that have the word Chayim in the title. We have Parashat Chayei Sarah and we have Parashat Vayechi, and both of those are parashiyot that deal with death. Ironically enough, right? Parashat Chayei Sarah, but Sarah has already died when the parasha begins. She doesn't really appear in this parasha. And in the same way, we could say that Avraham as well, although we've learned all about Avraham in the last couple of parashiyot, he's still alive very much. But Rav Soloveitchik points out that after Sarah dies, Avraham doesn't really make much contribution to the world anymore. He's more or less done all the great things that he's done. Once his wife is no longer there, he's still there, but he's not the same Avraham that he was anymore. He doesn't really make so much of a contribution in the way that he was previously. So in a sense, we begin Parashat Chayei Sarah talking about the life of Sarah. Perhaps you could say the life of Avraham and Sarah, and both of them have, in a sense, already finished their job. They're out of the picture before we even start, which says Darsheni. Why is it? And maybe the answer to that is that, of course, that the lives of tzaddikim, we know, and the lives of Avraham and Sarah do not end when Avraham and Sarah die physically. In a sense, it's only just beginning, because what they brought and what they taught and the legacy that they begin to leave in the world continues well long after they are gone physically, but they continue to be with us and continue to be here, and we continue to follow in their footsteps. So the parasha begins, right, Chayei Sarah, and it says that Sarah died in Kiryat Arba in Hebron, and we'll get to the Galil later, but we start off in Kiryat Arba. And so the parasha tells us, right, Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. Avraham came to lispod l'Sarah to deliver a hesped v'livkota, and to cry for her. And following that, it says Vayakom Avraham el pnei meito. Then Avraham gets up. He gets up from his mate, Vaydaber bnei chet, and then he goes to the bnei chet, and we have the whole discussion and negotiation in terms of buying the burial place in Marat HaMachpelah. So it's interesting that the word v'livkota, as you'll know, inside the Sefer Torah, and it's also the way it's printed here in the Chumash, is that the kaf, the letter in livkota, is a small letter. Sometimes we have in the Sefer Torah certain letters are printed a little bit larger or a little bit smaller. There's always a message in that. Here the kaf is smaller. So the Baal HaTurim tells us, why is it a small kaf in the word v'livkota? To tell us that Avraham did not cry excessively. He did not cry excessively over his wife who had just died, but he cried a little bit. That again is very, very strange. We know who Sarah Imenu was. We know what a loss she was. What we would expect. We would expect Avraham to cry a lot. Why does it say that there's a small kaf to emphasize the fact that he did not cry? So one answer that's given, Rashi brings something over here on Lispod Sarah v'livkota. He says, why are we told about this now? Says Rashi, Nismacha mitat Sarah la'akedat Yitzchak. We are told about the death of Sarah immediately after Akedat Yitzchak. Why? What is the connection between the two? Lefi she'al yadei besoret Akedah shenizdamen b'na l'shchita v'kimat shelo nishchat parcha nishmata mimena v'meta. Rashi here quotes the Midrash. The story in the Midrash is that somebody came to tell Sarah, right, after the Akedah, said, you know what happened? Right, Avraham just took Yitzchak up to the mountain and he was going to shecht him. And at that point, when Sarah heard that, she had a heart attack or whatever it is, and her soul left her. She couldn't bear to hear that news. One of the lessons the Balei Musa say, so when you go and you talk to somebody, if you're going to give them bad news, right? So you should always be very, very careful the way you talk to somebody. That's why if you know somebody was in an accident or something, you say everything's okay, but you should know. That way, a number of years ago, when my wife fell and broke her ankle. And it was an interesting and somewhat traumatic experience for a number of weeks. But the person, some very, very helpful bystander, was there, and he called me from her phone, and he said, "I'm here with your wife. She's okay, right? But she's broken her ankle." So the fact that he said she's okay, at least there's not something serious. Actually, as it happened, this was a number of years ago. He spoke in Hebrew, and I'd been living in Israel for a number of years, but I actually didn't know the word for ankle in Hebrew. So he told me that your wife is okay, but she broke her karsol. And all that I could think of was, what is a karsol? I have no idea. And I rushed off to the hospital as quickly as I could to find out what had been broken. But lahavdil, when the teacher calls the parents to tell them, how the kid is doing. So I learned this lesson when I was a teacher. That usually the teacher calls the parents when the child is misbehaving. It's bad news. No parent likes to get a phone call from the teacher. So nowadays, so the teachers know that you can call the parents as well to say good things. So I remember I called up one of the parents of the child in my class and I said, "Hello, I'm the teacher of so and so." And she said, "Well, what's wrong? What's he done?" I said, "No, I just want to tell you that he's doing very well." So then I learned that you should call and you should say everything's okay, but you should know. So that's. Right, so that's the way it is. Meaning, you tell the story. Sarah, do you know what happened? Avraham took Yitzchak to Shechtim, and she was not zocher to hear the end of that sentence. But in any event, so there are those who say, based on this Rashi and based on this Balaturim, why is it that Avraham did not cry excessively at this point? Because there is the Netivot Shalom expounds on this as well. He says after the Akedah. Right, so he's already done it. He's already passed the test. There's nothing left for him to do. But the Satan comes, the Yahrzeit Sarah comes and says, "Okay, you've done it, but now we're going to make you regret it. Now we're going to make you wish that you hadn't have done it, hadn't fulfilled it." So it's as if, what's the result of the Akedah? The result of the Akedah, so to speak, is that Sarah has died. So there was not that excessive crying to show that Avraham did not. She was going to die. A time had come, and it was going to happen one way or another. But to show that Avraham did not regret passing that test and fulfilling that mitzvah that Hashem had given him. So that is one answer, that's one suggestion. But I'd like to share with you another idea, and this comes from Rabbi Sacks. And the truth is, Rabbi Sacks wrote essays on the parsha many, many years, and they're all available online and in his books, etc. And usually from one year to the next, he will take a different theme, or he'll take a different idea in the parsha. It's quite unique that in Parshat Chayei Sarah, if you go through and you look at many of the essays, year after year, tend to focus on the same theme. And they tend to focus on the following theme, which is this. Let's think about where Avraham finds himself at this stage of life. Avraham Avinu has been promised by Kadosh Baruch Hu at the Brit Ben Abtarim, and he's passed all these ordeals. And he's been promised, right, we all remember, Lech Lecha Me'artzecha, right, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to make you a great nation, I'm going to give you a land, no less than 7 times. Avraham has been promised that he will have a land, that he and his descendants will inherit the land of Israel. How much land does Avraham own at this point? None. Absolutely nothing, not even a square inch. So he's been promised 7 times, but he has nothing to show for it. He's been promised he's going to be Av Hamon Goyim, he's going to be the father of a great nation. So he has a son Yishmael, and then he has a son Yitzchak, and he's promised, Beyitzchak yikarei lecha. Your promise of having descendants and being the father of a great nation, and nations will come about through Yitzchak. Yitzchak, who, according to the popular view in the Midrash, is 37 years old at this point. He nearly died, and he doesn't even have a wife. So there's the promise of the land has not been fulfilled. The promise of children, descendants, a nation, has not been fulfilled. He's done everything he was meant to do, but he's got nothing to show for it. And now his wife has died. So how would most people react in such a situation? Most ordinary mortals would exactly like that, right? With that face. They would say, "What, God, what do you want from me? What do you want from me? I've done everything. You've given me all these promises. I have nothing to show for it. I'm going to throw in the towel. I'm going to, enough. But that's not what Avraham does. What Avraham does, and that's why this entire parsha, it says, right, The crying here was not excessive. The crying was not excessive because Avraham is not throwing in the towel. Avraham is not giving in to despair. Avraham is not at this point waiting for God to act for him. Says Rabbi Sacks, the amazing thing here is that Avraham realizes that God waits for us to act too. And Avraham is going to become a partner with God, right? And he says, Vayakom Avraham me'al pnei meto. Avraham gets up. He gets up and then he does two things which take up the entirety of the rest of the parasha. The first thing he does is he says he has no land. So he'll go and he'll purchase land. He'll go and he'll buy a piece of land, the Ma'arat Mechpelah, right, from Ephron Achiti. And then he says he needs to be the father of a great nation, so Yitzchak needs to get married, so he sends off Eliezer to go and to find a wife for Yitzchak, and it goes at great length, and there's a lot of discussion in Chazal and in the Rishonim as to why the Torah elaborates for so long on this whole parasha, and tells us the whole story twice, it tells us as it's happening, it tells us as it's retold, but the entire parasha essentially is Avraham acting to fulfill the promises that God has given him. Right? He realizes that now is not the time. When we look through Jewish history and we look through our lives, there are times when we need to be passive. There have been generations, most generations of Jewish history, where all that we could do was be passive. But there are times when we are not meant to be passive, and we're not required to be passive, and we're required to get up and to become partners with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in creation. And that is essentially what Avraham does in this parasha, and that's what he teaches us. And I think that this is, again, most of that is the Rabbi Sacks idea. I'll say one more thing about this before I bring it down into our days. But this we've mentioned this once before. Avraham Avinu went through 10 ordeals. Asara nisyonot, that's the Mishnah Pirkei Avot, tells us there were 10 ordeals. What were those 10 ordeals exactly? So we have a number of different accounts, just like you have the 613 mitzvot, right? Everybody knows that there are Tariag mitzvot. What we can't agree on is what are the Tariag mitzvot, what's included. So that, the Rambam has his count, and the Ramban has his count, and the Sefer Mitzvot HaGadol has his count, and the Sefer Yereim has his, and the Sefer Chinuch, etc. So same thing when it comes to with 613, it's a bit more complicated. There's a lot more room for discrepancy. But it's just 10. Okay, so it's a simpler calculation. But we find amongst the Rishonim, we find the Rambam, and we find Rabbeinu Yonah, and we find others give different explanations as to what were the 10 nisyonot of Avraham Avinu. Just about everybody agrees that the final nisayon, the last ordeal, was the Akedah, with the exception of Rabbeinu Yonah. And Rabbeinu Yonah says the last ordeal was not the Akedah. That was the second last. That was the penultimate challenge. But the final ordeal was what we read about here, which is the purchase of a burial plot for Sarah. Now, it's generally accepted that the ordeals went in ascending order of difficulty. So the most difficult one came last. So we understand why most of the Rishonim would say the final ordeal was the Akedah. What could be more difficult than that? Going and purchasing real estate. I said this once, and somebody came up to me and said, Rabbi, if you think that purchasing real estate in Israel is easy, so you don't understand. So that's maybe, but there's something more to it. And this is an idea that I heard from Rabbi J.J. Shachter, who said in the name of his father. His father was Rabbi Herschel Shachter, not to be confused with Rabbi Herschel Shachter in YU, but Rabbi Herschel Shachter, who was the chaplain in the U.S. Army, and he was there at the liberation of Buchenwald. And he said, in our generation, we can understand what this means. What was Avram's final ordeal? He says, you see, what was Avram's final ordeal after the Akedah? That Avram could have come along and said, after the Akedah, God, I've done it all. I've done everything you've asked of me. There's nothing more that you can require from me at this point. Now's the time to cash in. Now's the time to have all the promises. Now's the time to live in peace and have a land and have security and have everything. And he said, in our days, the Jewish people experienced an Akedah, not one Akedah, but 6 million Akedah. And if there was ever a time that we could have thought, surely, now it's up, now it's time to cash in. Now it's time to receive the promises, now it's time to have our land, now it's time to have peace and to have security, and anti-Semitism is over, and it's a relic of the past, and it's all finished, and it's all done with, and now's the time when we can sit in shalom and shalva and all of that. And God says, no, it's not yet. You still have the ordeal that Avraham has to face, and the ordeal that we face is that you've done it all, you've been through everything, but there's still another ordeal. It's not the time to sit and rest on your laurels. You're still going to have to negotiate 400 shekel kesef this way or that way. You're going to have to haggle. You're going to have to fight. You're going to have to fight for your very right to exist. That's the ordeal. And it's because it comes after that that it's still that's what the ordeal is, and that all ties in very nicely with what we said before, with what Rabbi Sacks says. And again, I think this idea of Avraham gets up and he stands up and he says, we have to arise and we have to fight and we have to build and we have to make it happen. And Hashem's given us a promise. It can only happen because we have that promise, but we have to work for it. And that's why, I wasn't with you on the tour today. I'm looking forward to joining you tomorrow with all the places. And I'm sure you've already heard and met people and heard incredible stories, and there'll be more tomorrow. But you think about, what it was to come here, to come into this land, to come into this area of Israel when there was absolutely nothing. And those chalutzim and those pioneers who, going back when the state was established, and not going so far back, but over the last 2 years as well, the resilience that people have shown, the fortitude, the faith, to say that we are continuing, we are going to be partners, just like Abraham. We're going to go and we're going to carry on and we're going to build, showing us how we are able to get up and able to move forward. So that is one idea that I think again ties in with all these ideas we've been saying. Let me say one other thing, and if we have time we'll have a third, but not, we don't necessarily have to. I don't want to keep people too late. Idea number 2 is the following: there is a midrash which brings a lot of comfort to many, many Rabbanim. This Midrash has given comfort to many Rabbanim throughout the ages, and immediately you'll know why. The Midrash says that Rabbi Akiva was giving a shir, and while Rabbi Akiva was giving his shir, the Talmidim started to drift off. They started to fall asleep. As I said, this has given comfort to many Darshanim throughout the ages. If it happened to Rabbi Akiva, it can happen to me. It's okay, you don't have to worry. Right? I'm not hinting anything. I don't see anybody who's asleep right now.
We drank wine today.
Count of 3, everybody.
So what did Rabbi Akiva do? I had a rabbi in yeshiva once who was very, you have the different types, different types of rabbanim and different types of personalities. Some will just, let it go, whatever, and some will not. And I remember he would go up, a person would fall asleep, and he would go up to them, and he would stand there, and he would talk very, very loudly, and he would bang on the table when the person gets up. What happened? He says, next time you don't fall asleep in my shir. Okay. So what did Rabbi Akiva do to wake up the students? He could have banged on the shtender, he could have clapped his hands, whatever. So the Midrash says, so Rabbi Akiva told them something. He told them a vort that's going to pique their interest. We don't know what the shir was about before that. It's very interesting. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know what was he talking about beforehand. But this is what Rabbi Akiva said. He said, in order to wake up his students, he said, why was it, right? How did Esther become queen over 127 provinces? That was the question. This is what was going to wake everybody up. And what's the answer? It was in the merit of Sarah. Of Sarah Imenu. We read in our parasha, Vayu Chayei Sarah 100 shana, ve'esrim shana, ve'sheva shanim shnei Chayei Sarah. Sarah lived for 127 years. So why was it? What was the? How was it that Esther Amalka merited to become queen of 127 countries, 127 provinces? However we translate Medinot, because Sarah Imenu lived for 127 years, and then the Talmidim woke up. Okay. I mean, again, I don't know what he was talking about beforehand, if that woke them up. But you read this and you listen to this midrash and you say, okay, it's a fancy gematria. Okay, big deal. There it's 127 and there it's 127. We know that when numbers come up, there's a connection. But what's the connection? As you would say in modern Hebrew, ma kesher. Right? What's one got to do with the other? So Esther 127 countries. Sarah lived 127 years. Big deal. What does that mean? Number one. Number two. So number one is, what does it mean? Number two is, why is that the thing? Why is that the gematria? I'm sure you could find another gematria that's going to excite the Talmidim more. Right? That's the thing that's got everybody dozing off. And this is the thing that's going to wake them up. So I heard an explanation. I heard a tremendous explanation for this, which is to say maybe the following. When the Midrash says, and the problem with the explanation is that it doesn't mean that they fell asleep, kipshuto, so that the nechama that we've given all the darshanim throughout the ages has just disappeared. But it means, the explanation is to say that this whole thing is a mashal. When it says that the students were dozing off, that they were falling asleep, so sleep, night, darkness, that represents exile. It's in a metaphorical sense. They were sleeping. They were in the dark. They were in the dark of night. They were in the long dark of exile. They thought it was all over. They had given up hope. Rabbi Akiva is the figure who gives us hope throughout Jewish history. Rabbi Akiva lived in one of the most difficult times of Jewish history, just after the Churban, throughout the time of the persecutions of the Romans. Terrible, terrible suffering we know from the 10 martyrs, right? The piyut that we say on Yom Kippur and on Tisha B'Av. And of course, Rabbi Akiva is one of those. He was tortured to death by the Romans for studying Torah, for teaching Torah in public. Terrible, terrible things that happened. The Gemara in Bava Basra tells us that during the time of these persecutions, there were those who said, right, by rights we should stop having children. We should let the Jewish people come to an end of its own accord. That's what the Gemara says. Incredible statement. We don't find things like that in the Gemara, but this was the time. These were the depths of despair that people were going through. And maybe the message that Rabbi Akiva is trying to tell them is the following. He says, Rabbi say, this is not the first time we've had dark times. This is not the first time that we've experienced tragedy and experienced crisis in Jewish history and in Jewish life. Go back to the story of Megillas Esther. And again, we all are prejudiced because we know how the story ends. I cannot help thinking, and I've thought this many times over the last few months and years, and Rabbi Wein would say this as well. Right now we are living through Megillat Esther. You look at some of the things that are happening, and I'm not going to give a political commentary on what's going on, but you look at some of the things that are happening in the world and that have happened in the world over the past 2 years, and it makes no sense. And it's obvious and it's clear to us that somebody is pulling strings. Exactly how the strings are being pulled, in what direction, where it's going to lead, we don't know. But there is a bigger plan at play. That is clear. That is obvious. And during the time of Megillat Esther, that was the case, but it wasn't so obvious during the time. We read the story with the hindsight, which is always 2020. I always tell when I'm talking to students, high school students, or, and I say to them, how long does it take Megillat Esther from beginning to end? And they always answer 40 minutes. But how long? How long does it take from the beginning of the story until the end of the story? So they say, on Hoshana Rabbah, I gave a talk to a shiva, and I asked him this question. And one of the guys said, 1 year, 6 months, 13 years from beginning to end. And if you were there in the middle of the story, you would not have known how it ended. Right? And when Mordechai says to Esther, I've always thought, when Mordechai says to Esther, Mi yodeh im neit kazot higat lemalchut. Who knows if it's not for this moment that you became queen? We always read that pasuk and we say, who knows if not for this moment? Maybe this is why? What do you mean maybe? Obviously, this is why you become queen. It's for this moment. But no, in the Megillah, it's who knows, maybe, because at the time, you can't see the full picture. So Esther Amakai is living in the palace. She has been kidnapped. She's being held hostage. We always have this romantic version. She's the queen. It was not so pleasant. It was not so pleasant to be the queen, and she's been taken hostage. She's being raped by the king. She's completely on her own. She feels that everyone has abandoned her. She feels that God has forsaken her. The Jewish people under a threat of annihilation, and no one knows how it's going to end. So Rabbi Akiva says to his students, you think this is the first time we've lived through darkness? We've lived through darkness before. And how did we get out of it? How did we get out? How was Esther successful in having the resilience and the faith and working through and being able to realize that she could rule over 127 provinces, which means she was in a position where she could help and the Jewish people could ultimately be saved? She looked back. She looked back to Sarah Imenu, who lived for 127 years. That's the meaning. It's not a fancy gematria. Rabbi Akiva is telling his students there's a connection. We're living in a continuum of Jewish history. And we have those spiritual resources within us. We have the power, we have the qualities that we've gotten from our ancestors. And if we go back and we look through history, you know that we have promises from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if we, like Avraham, will stand up and take the qualities that we have inherited from Avraham, and we'll work together with God so we can survive and we can thrive and we can get through whatever darkness we may currently find ourselves in. But we will overcome that darkness and we can wake up. And that's what it means that they wake up. That they have hope again, and that they can look forward, and they have something that they can know that where they're going. And finally, let me share with you one third idea, which is the following. There's something very, very interesting. The beginning of our parsha talks about Avraham buying this field, and buying this land in Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara in Kiddushin, the beginning of Masechet Kiddushin, the Gemara talks about the mitzvah of Kiddushin, of betrothal. And it says that there are 3 methods of betrothal. And one of them is what's called Kiddushei Kesef. This is the method we use nowadays. A couple stands under the chuppah, and the chatan gives a ring to the kala, and he says, Arei at mekudeshet li. Right? It can be, nowadays we use a ring. In theory, it didn't have to be a ring. I saw in a book once that said it can be anything that's of monetary value. So it could be a potato. Right? I'd like to see the chatan who tries to give his wife a potato under the chuppah. But we use it. But the point is that a ring that is something of monetary value. So the Gemara says, how do we know that we can do Kiddushei Kesef? Right? And it learns it out by what's called a Gzera Shava. Gzera Shava is where we have the same word or the same phrase that appears in two different places in the Torah, and we understand, we have a tradition that those two places are connected, and we can understand from the context and the meaning of one place to the context and the meaning of the other place of that word. And the word that appears is the word what's called kicha mistei Ephron. The word lakacha, to take, is the word that's used in the context of marriage, and it's the word that is used in the context of Avraham purchasing the field from Ephron Hachiti. And the question is, I don't understand. We're talking about, you want to make a Gzera Shava, you want to make a connection. We're talking about marriage. We're talking about a couple coming and investing their lives together and building and giving everything to one another. And you're going to compare that to a real estate purchase. Again, notwithstanding the fact that real estate purchases in Israel. It seems very, very strange. It seems very, very odd. Right? We understand that when a marriage takes place, when a chatan and a kala stand together under the chuppah, the man is not purchasing the woman. Right? That's not what it means. That's not how it takes place. But why is it, of all the places to learn this method of kiddushin, we learn it from the purchase of a field, from the purchase of land? So the answer is, if we find that question difficult, so either we've misunderstood what marriage is, or we've misunderstood what Eretz Yisrael. We've misunderstood what it means to purchase a plot of land in the land of Israel. This land is not just an acquisition. It's not a monetary acquisition. It's something so much deeper than that. And this, Rav Kook says, is a famous piece in Orot. It's famous because it's the opening passage. So if you don't get through much, you get through this. Everybody knows the first paragraph. And after that, they stop and then it becomes too difficult and you close the book. But Rav Kook says something tremendous. In the beginning of Orot, he says the following. He says, Eretz Yisrael einena davar chitzoni, kinyan chitzoni le'uma. It's not, the case of an acquisition, a transaction that you make. Rak betor emtsa'i lematara shel hitatlut haklalit ve'achzakat kiyoma hachomri. Having a land, having a connection to the land of Israel is not just a means to an end. It's not just that, we have a piece of land that we need so that we can have a safe haven, so that we can have something else. We have that as well. But it's something much, much more than that. He says it's not about our hachzakat kiyum hachomri, it's not about our material sustenance, afila ruchani, or even spiritual, cultural, whatever you want to say. He says, Eretz Yisrael chativa atzmutit, kshura bekesher chayim im hauma, chavuka b'skulot pnimiyot im metziuta. It's bundled up it's very, very hard to translate Rav Kook into English. But essentially what he's saying is that our connection with the land is not like the connection you have, it's not transactional, but it's inherent, it's a relationship. We have a relationship with this land. And we see this throughout Tanakh, we see this throughout history, right? And, everybody knows, very, very famous, the passages that Mark Twain writes in The Innocents Abroad. Before Mark Twain, we had the Ramban, L'Havdil. But they talk about how they come to this land and there was nothing here. It was absolutely desolate. It was all desert. And for years in the Tochacha, one of the pieces of the Tochacha is that the land will remain desolate. And the Ramban writes that is actually a blessing in disguise. It's a blessing in disguise because the land remains loyal to the Jewish people and it won't let others, strangers, foreigners who come and try and take over and try and conquer us. So for years, for centuries, it was a backwater. There was nothing. Nobody could, it was a desert. There were thorns. There was nothing here. Nowadays, maybe you've already seen, maybe you'll still see. But the fruits of Eretz Yisrael, we know that the desert is blooming. Israel is a agricultural powerhouse, an economic powerhouse, a military powerhouse, technological powerhouse, a spiritual powerhouse. In all those ways, we've come back and we've been able to rekindle that connection, that relationship that we have here together with the land. So those are three ideas that I thought relevant also to Rabbi Sacks, also to the parasha, and also to where we are on the theme of this trip, and the ideas of resilience, the ideas of faith, the idea of fortitude, the idea of hope, of never giving up hope, and of our continuing connection to Jewish history, to continuing the legacy, and of our continuation to our connection to the land. So those are some things I think to think about as we continue to tour and continue to see the beautiful sights and sounds of northern Israel tomorrow.